My name is Vernon Kirkland, and I have never told this story in full. I gave pieces of it over the years, trimmed and sanded down until they sounded like stress or bad judgment or a night that got away from me. But the truth is heavier than that, and it has waited a long time for me to stop pretending I didn't notice what the forest was doing. I am telling this now because enough time has passed that the men who taught me how to stay quiet are either dead or retired into irrelevance, and because I no longer believe silence keeps anyone safe. In 1978, I was 34 years old and 7 years into my ranger service. I worked patrol, not desk duty, not interpretation. I knew trails by the way the ground felt through my boots, and I could tell which radio towers were misaligned just by the echo in a transmission. I believed in patterns then, rotations, shifts, handoffs, the idea that nothing stayed with one ranger too long because familiarity bred mistakes. That belief was part of the job, and it was the first thing that quietly disappeared. The assignment came through without ceremony, no briefing room, no supervisor explanation. Just a handwritten note clipped to my weekly schedule redirecting me to a sector I had never patrolled before. The handwriting was careful, almost too careful, and the ink had bled into the paper as if it had been written slowly. I remember checking the rotation board twice because that sector wasn't on it. There was no name beside it, no rotation cycle, no history. When I asked about it, the answer came too fast. You're up, that was it, no reason, no time frame, no backup assignment listed. The man who said it didn't meet my eyes, and that should have been my cue to push harder. But I didn't. I had learned by then that some questions didn't get you answers, they got you watched. The sector sat north of the main access roads, where the forest thickened and the maintenance budget thinned. The truck they assigned me was an older service model with a transmission that liked to grind unless you treated it gently. The radio was analog manual tuning, with a persistent low hiss no matter how you adjusted it. I signed out a flashlight, extra batteries, a paper map folded so many times the creases had softened into fabric, and a fresh logbook that smelled like new glue and old paper. The drive-in took longer than expected, not because the road was rough, but because it didn't behave the way roads usually do. The curves felt inconsistent, like the spacing between them changed every time I looked down at the map. The mile markers didn't line up with the odometer. I told myself it was an old truck and a worn road, and that explanation held just long enough to keep me from turning around. By the time I reached the sector boundary, the light was already thinning. The sign marking the zone stood crooked, its lettering faded to the point where you had to know what it said to read it. There was no warning language, no restricted notice, just a name I didn't recognize and a number that didn't correspond to any system I knew. I parked beside it and shut off the engine, and the quiet settled in immediately, too quickly, like something had been waiting for the noise to stop. I radioed in my position as required. The reply came back clean, but the voice on the other end used a call sign that hadn't been active in years. I corrected it out of habit. There was a pause, long enough for me to check the handset. Then the voice repeated the call sign exactly the same way. It acknowledged my correction without changing anything. I wrote it down in the logbook. That habit probably saved my life. The forest inside the sector was older than the rest of the park. You could feel it in the density, in the way the trees grew closer together without competing for light. The underbrush was sparse in places where it shouldn't have been, and thick where the soil didn't support it. That inconsistency tugged at my attention in a way I couldn't articulate then, but I feel it even now when I think back to that first stretch of trail. My flashlight beam didn't reach as far as it should have. Not dim, not flickering, just shortened. The edges of things seemed to blur until I stepped closer, as if the forest preferred to be observed at a certain distance and resisted anything beyond that. I told myself it was fog forming early, but the air didn't feel damp. The first checkpoint was a simple clearing standard procedure, a place to log conditions and confirm the trail was passable. I stepped out of the truck and immediately felt the temperature drop, not enough to be dangerous, but enough to register. The silence pressed in again, and this time I noticed what was missing. No insects, no birds, no wind through the canopy. My boots sounded too loud on the dirt. I logged the checkpoint and scanned the tree line. The feeling that followed wasn't fear. It was assessment. The sense that something was measuring my presence rather than reacting to it. That thought embarrassed me at the time. It felt unprofessional, so I pushed T aside and got back in the truck. The deeper I went, the more the trail seemed to resist memory. I would glance down at the map, look up again, and feel like I had misjudged the distance I'd traveled. The radio hiss changed pitch in subtle waves, almost rhythmic, and every so often a voice would surface through it long enough to form a word before sinking back under. The words were always procedural. Check in, confirm position, repeat last transmission. I answered every time, because not answering felt worse. At one point I passed a fallen tree that had been cut cleanly through, not by a chainsaw but by something heavier. The cut was too smooth, too even. I noted it and moved on. And when I passed the same tree again 10 minutes later, I checked the map and the compass to confirm I hadn't turned around. I hadn't. The trail had simply looped in a way it shouldn't have been able to. That was when I noticed the boot prints. They were old but not weathered, embedded deep enough to suggest weight, but with edges still sharp. The tread pattern was outdated, from a manufacturer that had phased out that sole years earlier. They led off the trail and into the trees at a shallow angle, like whoever made them hadn't been trying to hide their path. They just left. I stood there longer than I should have, listening again for sounds that didn't come. The radio stayed silent this time, as if waiting to see what I would do. I remember thinking about rotation schedules, about how many rangers should have passed through this sector before me. If those prints were old, there should have been records, log entries, reports. I followed the prints because that was the job. They led to a secondary clearing I didn't recognize, one not marked on the map. The ground dipped slightly toward the center, and the trees leaned inward as if shaped by long-term pressure rather than growth patterns. There was a ranger pack sitting upright in the middle of the clearing, resting on its base like it had been set down carefully. I approached it slowly, calling out protocol phrases even though I knew no one would answer. The pack was weathered but intact. The straps were adjusted for a man my height. The contents were standard: rations, radio batteries, log sheets, a flashlight identical to the one in my hand. The name stitched into the inside flap stopped me cold. It wasn't someone I knew personally, but I recognized it from an old incident report I'd read during training. A ranger who had transferred out under vague circumstances and never resurfaced in any other park records. At the time, I'd assumed he'd left the service quietly. That assumption collapsed right there in that clearing. I logged the find and radioed it in. The response came back immediately, too immediately, and told me to secure the equipment and continue my patrol as scheduled. There was no request for clarification, no surprise, no follow-up questions. That was when the unease sharpened into something heavier. The light was failing fast now, and the forest seemed to be leaning closer. The flashlight beam caught movement between the trees more than once, but every time I focused on it there was nothing there. No animal, no shifting branches, just the sense of something repositioning itself out of view. I secured the pack in the truck and continued on because turning back felt like violating an unspoken rule. I didn't know what that rule was yet, but I felt its weight all the same. The trail narrowed and then widened again without reason. The radio crackled to life and spoke my name for the first time. Not my call sign, my name. The voice was calm, familiar in tone but not in source. It asked me to confirm my direction of travel. I answered automatically, and the voice acknowledged me before I finished speaking. It told me I was making good time. It told me to continue. I remember thinking that the forest felt busy, not active, but engaged, like a place doing work it had done for a long time with or without oversight. That was the first moment the thought crossed my mind that this sector wasn't dangerous because of what lived in it, but because of what it was used for. When I reached the end of the marked trail, the map stopped making sense entirely. The paper showed blank space where the forest clearly continued, thick and deliberate. There was no turnaround indicated, no note explaining the omission. I shut off the engine and sat there, watching my breath fog the windshield, feeling the weight of a decision I didn't yet understand. The radio clicked once, sharp and deliberate. Proceed. That single word carried more authority than any supervisor I'd ever answered to, and that terrified me more than the darkness ever could. I should have turned around when the radio told me to proceed. I know that now. I knew it then too, at least on some level that didn't have words yet. But the longer I sat there with the engine idling, the clearer it became that the decision had already been made by something other than me. The forest wasn't waiting for my choice. It was waiting for my compliance. I drove forward. The trail beyond the mapped boundary wasn't rougher or narrower. It was smoother, almost maintained in a way that felt intentional. The tires stopped crunching gravel and began rolling over packed earth that held no loose stones. The trees on either side grew closer together, not encroaching, but aligned, as if they'd been trained to respect the path. They rose straight and tall, branches trimmed back far higher than any trail crew would bother with. That should have been impossible. No records, no funding, no labor assigned. The radio hiss softened. The background noise dropped away until the channel was almost clean. I keyed the mic to check in and stopped myself halfway through. The urge to speak felt intrusive, like interrupting someone else's conversation. I lowered my hand and listened instead. That was when I noticed the cadence. The silence wasn't empty. It moved in intervals, subtle rises and falls in pressure that reminded me of breathing. Not loud enough to hear, but consistent enough to feel in the cab of the truck. My ears popped slightly, then adjusted. The headlights cut through the darkness ahead, but the beam flattened sooner than it should have, edges dissolving into a gray that didn't behave like fog. I passed another clearing. This one was larger and more deliberate. The ground had been leveled not recently, but with care. There were old tire impressions pressed deep into the soil, long since dried and preserved. The pattern didn't match park vehicles. It matched military transport from a generation earlier. I knew that tread because my father had driven one when I was a kid. At the edge of the clearing stood a structure. It wasn't a building in the usual sense, more like a frame. Posts sunk deep into the ground, connected by crossbeams that supported nothing. The wood was old but not rotted, treated with something dark that had soaked into the grain. The shape suggested function without revealing purpose, like scaffolding left behind after the work it supported had moved elsewhere. I parked and stepped out with the flashlight. The air felt heavier here, denser, like walking into a room with poor ventilation. My boots left clear prints in the soil, but when I looked back a few seconds later, the edges had softened as if the ground were slowly reclaiming them. There were markings on the posts, numbers, dates, short notations carved carefully rather than scratched. They ran in vertical lines stacked one above the other. Some dates were crossed out, some were underlined twice. The most recent entry matched the year I was standing in. I logged the structure and took photographs. The flash reflected oddly off the treated wood, absorbed rather than bounced back. When I turned to photograph the clearing behind me, it looked different through the lens, wider, flatter, the tree line farther away than it should have been. I lowered the camera and the space snapped back into its tighter configuration. The radio clicked again. "You can leave it." The voice was closer now, not louder, but more present, as if distance no longer applied. I didn't answer. I didn't ask who was speaking. I already knew the answer wouldn't help. I got back in the truck and continued. The trail began to slope downward, gradual at first, then more pronounced. The forest changed with the elevation. The trees grew thicker, trunks wider, roots pushing up through the soil like knuckles. The smell shifted too, not rot, not decay, but something mineral, like wet stone and old metal left underground too long. I saw the sign before I reached it. It stood at the side of the trail, partially obscured by shadow. A simple wooden board bolted to a post. No reflective paint. No official seal. Just words carved deep enough to cast their own shadows in the beam of my headlights. Authorized exit only. There was no arrow, no explanation. I slowed the truck and stared at it longer than I meant to. The phrasing bothered me. Not restricted access. Not no entry, exit. That implied something beyond the sign that wasn't meant to release everyone who entered. I passed it anyway. The radio stayed silent for a long stretch after that. No hiss. No background noise. It felt like the forest was listening again, attention focused, waiting to see if I would notice something important on my own. The trail narrowed and then opened into a basin so gradual I didn't realize I was descending into it until the walls were already around me. The basin was vast and uneven. The ground dipped and rose in shallow waves, covered in low vegetation that didn't match the surrounding forest. The trees here were spaced wider apart, and their branches twisted inward, overlapping just enough to break up the sky into fractured shapes. The stars above were visible, but their arrangement felt off, subtly misaligned from memory. There were more structures here. Not buildings, but installations. Poles driven into the ground in deliberate patterns, cables running between them, slack in places and taut in others. Some dissap, pared into the earth. Others ran up into the trees and vanished into the canopy. There were boxes mounted at various heights, metal housings with analog dials and gauges behind thick glass. None of them should have been powered. As I approached one, the needle inside twitched. I stopped walking. The ground beneath my boots vibrated faintly, not enough to unbalance me, but enough to register as movement. The sensation traveled up through my legs and settled behind my eyes, creating a pressure that made it hard to focus on any single detail for long. The radio came alive in my hand without warning. "We record what passes through." The voice no longer bothered with protocol. It spoke plainly now, as if formalities had served their purpose. It told me the basin was stable. It told me the forest corrected itself when guided properly. It told me that not everyone was compatible. I asked, compatible with what? The pause that followed stretched longer than any silence I'd experienced that night. The vibration intensified slightly, as if the ground itself were considering the question. "With leaving." That answer hit me harder than any threat could have. I thought of the Ranger pack in my truck, the outdated boot prints, the names in old reports that never quite closed their loops. I understood then that the forest wasn't trapping people in the way stories usually frame these things. It was filtering them, making determinations based on criteria no one had ever bothered to define publicly. I took a step back, and the vibration sharpened. I took another, and the nearest gauge spiked violently before settling again. The radio crackled, not angry, not urgent, just firm. That's far enough. Fear finally caught up with me then. Not panic, not the urge to run, but the cold understanding that I was standing inside a process that did not recognize fear as a relevant variable. I was data to it, a temporary input whose outcome had not yet been finalized. I forced myself to breathe evenly and scan the basin for an exit. The trail behind me was still there, but it looked narrower than before, edges fraying as if the forest were slowly pulling it apart. There were other paths too, faint impressions in the vegetation leading away from the center. Some looked older, some looked recent. None of them were marked. The radio spoke again. The forest chooses who leaves. That sentence settled into me with a weight I still carry decades later, because it wasn't a warning. It was a statement of established policy. I don't know how long I stood there, listening, feeling the ground hum beneath my boots, watching the needles on the instruments twitch in response to my breathing. Eventually, the pressure behind my eyes eased slightly, as if a decision had been postponed. You may proceed for now. I didn't thank it. I turned and walked back to the truck slowly, careful not to move too quickly, as if sudden motion might be interpreted as defiance. The vibration followed me to the cab, then receded as I started the engine. As I drove away from the basin, the radio remained silent again, but the silence felt different now. Not observant, not curious, resigned. I didn't know it then, but that was the sound of a system making a note and moving on. I did not sleep after leaving the basin. Not that night. Not the night after that. I drove until the sky began to pale at the edges and the forest thinned into shapes I recognized again, then pulled over on a gravel turnout and sat there with the engine off, hands on the wheel waiting for something to follow me. It never did. That absence was worse than pursuit. It felt intentional, like I had been dismissed rather than spared. When I finally returned to the station, the morning shift was already underway. The building smelled like burnt coffee and damp wool uniforms. Someone nodded at me in passing and asked if it had been a quiet night. I said yes. That was the first lie I told to survive what came next. I filed my logbook carefully. I wrote about trail conditions, weather anomalies, minor equipment observations. I did not write about the sign. I did not write about the basin. I did not write about the voice. The act of omission felt practiced, as if I had been trained for it without realizing. When I slid the logbook across the counter, the clerk checked it in without comment. He didn't flip through the pages. He just stamped the cover and pushed it into the outgoing tray. I went to my locker to stow my gear and found something that stopped me cold. The Ranger pack I had secured in my truck was already inside, resting neatly on the bench beneath my locker door. The straps were folded. The zipper was closed. The name stitched inside the flap faced upward, clearly visible. I stood there for a long time, watching other Rangers move around me, laughing, complaining about schedules, complaining about the weather. None of them noticed me standing frozen in place. None of them reacted to the pack. I finally closed the locker door slowly, as if sudden movement might draw attention. In from the wrong direction. I tried to report the find later that morning. I asked my supervisor if there were any open cases involving missing personnel in the northern sector. He told me no. He didn't check a file. He didn't ask me why I was asking. He said it the way you say something you've been instructed to say repeatedly until it stops sounding strange. I pressed once more carefully, mentioning outdated equipment and irregular trail maintenance. His expression changed just enough for me to notice. A tightening around the eyes. A warning. He told me the sector had been decommissioned temporarily due to administrative review. He told me my assignment there had been provisional and would not be repeated. He told me to let it go. That phrase carried weight. Let it go, not forget, not move on. Let it go, as if what I had encountered were something still holding onto me. The radio followed me for the rest of the week, not physically, not audibly, but in moments of quiet I could feel the cadence again. That subtle rise and fall in pressure, like a breath taken just out of sync with my own. It happened when I was alone. It never happened when others were present. At night, I dreamed of trails that rearranged themselves behind my footsteps. I dreamed of signs that only appeared once you passed them. I dreamed of standing at the edge of the basin, while unseen hands adjusted instruments around me, not restraining me, just fine-tuning my position. The dreams always ended the same way, with me waking up just before something decided whether I was finished. 3 days after my patrol, I was called into a meeting that hadn't been on the schedule. No paperwork, no notice, just a request delivered by someone who wouldn't meet my eyes. The room was small, windowless. There were 2 men inside I had never seen before. They wore Park Service jackets, but without name tags. They asked me to describe my patrol. I gave them the version I had written down. They listened without interrupting. They did not take notes. When I finished, one of them asked me a question that didn't fit. He asked me if I had felt disoriented. I said no. He asked me if I had experienced auditory anomalies. I said the radio had interference. He nodded as if that were expected. He asked me if I had seen any unofficial signage. I hesitated just long enough for him to notice, then said no. The second man finally spoke. He told me that certain areas of the park exhibited geological and acoustic irregularities that could affect perception. He told me that extended exposure could lead to stress responses that manifested as narrative distortion. He told me that the department had protocols for managing such effects, and that my cooperation would be appreciated. Cooperation, that word again. They offered me a transfer, not a promotion, not a demotion, a lateral move to a southern sector with predictable traffic and clear boundaries. They framed it as concern. They framed it as support. I understood it as containment. I accepted. That should have been the end of it. It was. The forest didn't follow me south in any physical sense, but the understanding did. Once you know a system exists, you start seeing its edges everywhere. Inconsistencies in reports, missing follow-ups, closed cases with no conclusions. I began to recognize the language of omission in paperwork the same way I recognized animal tracks in mud. I also began to notice patterns in disappearances. Not hikers, not tourists, rangers, contractors, temporary staff, people who knew how to read land and navigate without markers, people whose absence could be absorbed quietly into administrative gaps. Every time I saw one of those cases, I felt the pressure behind my eyes again, brief and faint, like a reminder. The moment I decided to quit came 6 months later. It wasn't dramatic. There was no final confrontation or revelation. I was reviewing archived logs for a routine audit when I found an entry dated decades earlier. The handwriting was different, but the phrasing was identical to my own. Descriptions of trail behavior I hadn't written down anywhere except in my head. The entry ended with a sentence I recognized immediately. Subject released, pending recalibration. My hands shook as I closed the book. I understood then that what had happened to me was not unusual. It was rare, but it was not unique. The forest chose who left, but the department decided who returned. I submitted my resignation the next morning. No explanation beyond personal reasons. No attempt to persuade me otherwise. My supervisor accepted it without surprise, as if he had been expecting it since the night I drove into that sector. On my last day, I cleaned out my locker slowly. I left the pack where it was. I took my flashlight, my map, and the logbook I had been issued that week. The blank pages at the back bothered me more than anything else. I thought leaving the service would sever whatever connection remained. I was wrong. The first letter arrived a year later. No return address. No postage sent. AMP I recognized. The paper was old. The ink was faded but legible. It thanked me for my service. It referenced my compatibility assessment. It expressed relief that I had complied. I burned it. More followed over the years, always polite, always brief, always framed as correspondence from an administrative entity that had never existed on any organizational chart. They never threatened. They never demanded. They simply reminded me that the system endured. The worst part is that I believe them. I am telling this now because time has thinned whatever protection silence once offered. The park has expanded. New sectors have been opened. New rangers assigned. New trails cut through land that does not behave the way maps insist it should. If you are one of them, and you feel the forest paying attention to you, do not mistake that for imagination. Do not assume danger always announces itself loudly. Some dangers are procedural. Some dangers wear uniforms. The forest chooses who leaves. And sometimes, it lets you go only long enough to understand why others didn't. I have lived with that sentence for most of my life. The forest chooses who leaves. It settled into me the way certain truths do, quietly at first, then with increasing weight as the years passed and more evidence accumulated around it. I stopped trying to disprove it somewhere in my 40s, after the third phone call that started with the same careful phrasing and ended with someone asking me if I remembered how the trail had felt under my boots. I never returned to the park after I quit, not as a ranger, not as a visitor, not even in passing. I built my life around avoidance without admitting that's what it was. I took jobs that kept me in cities, concrete and noise and predictable geometry. I married late. I slept lightly. I learned how to wake without moving, how to listen to a room before trusting it enough to breathe normally. The letters stopped eventually, not because the system ended, but because it no longer needed to check on me. That distinction matters. I was no longer under evaluation. I had been filed away as resolved. I know that because of what happened in 2009. A former coworker tracked me down through a mutual contact. He was retired by then, voice roughened by age and something else he didn't name. We met for coffee in a place with too many windows. He didn't waste time. He asked me if I remembered the northern sector from 1978. I didn't answer. He nodded like that was enough. He told me there had been an incident. A ranger trainee and a senior officer assigned to a newly opened extension of the park. Same terrain type, same administrative language, same pattern of omissions. The trainee never came back. The senior officer did 3 days later, disoriented and unable to account for the missing time. He resigned within a month. The official explanation blamed terrain confusion and inadequate supervision. The internal explanation never made it to paper. My coworker said the language was familiar. He said it sounded like something that had been in circulation for a long time. He asked me one question before we parted. He asked if I thought the forest was getting worse. I told him no. I told him it was getting better at what it did. That night I took out the old map I had kept folded in a drawer for decades. The creases were soft now, edges worn thin from time rather than use. The blank spaces bothered me more than they ever had, not because they were unknown, but because they were intentional. They weren't mistakes, they were accommodations. I traced the boundary of the sector I had patrolled with my finger and realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. The shape wasn't random. It curved and narrowed in ways that matched watershed patterns, pressure zones, areas where the land naturally absorbed stress. The forest hadn't been chosen for the system. The forest was the system. Everything else was infrastructure layered on top of it, trying to speak its language without ever quite understanding it. The installations, the logbooks, the radios, they weren't controlling anything, they were listening, and sometimes they were negotiating. That is why the forest chooses who leaves. It doesn't hate, it doesn't hunt, it doesn't trap indiscriminately. It evaluates compatibility the way an environment always has. The difference is that someone noticed and decided to cooperate rather than warn. I quit after one night because staying would have meant learning how to assist that process. Staying would have meant explaining it to myself in ways that made it acceptable. Staying would have turned observation into participation. I have no proof that telling this story will change anything. I don't expect investigations or admissions or apologies. I am not asking you to believe me completely. I am asking you to pay attention to what gets left out. If you work in parks, forests, or protected land, watch the paperwork as closely as you watch the terrain. Not all danger is physical, some of it is administrative. Of it arrives in calm voices and clean forms and reassignment, offers framed as concern. If you are a visitor and you feel the trail subtly correcting your direction, do not fight it, but do not follow it deeper either. Turn back early. Leave before the decision feels mutual. The forest let me go once. That does not mean it will do so again, and it does not mean it regrets the others. I have carried this long enough.